Because when Jasmine Crockett issued her statement following the Supreme Court's ruling to approve Texas redistricting, she didn't simply object. She delivered a caution that has Republicans privately concerned behind the scenes. Before we examine why Jasmine Crockett's reaction to being eliminated by redistricting might be the most damaging development for Texas Republicans, be sure to hit that subscribe button because this narrative demonstrates how a Supreme Court triumph could become a devastating strategic error. The announcement came early on that Friday morning, the type of political bombshell that instantly takes over every media outlet and social platform. The Supreme Court had determined Texas could implement its freshly drawn redistricting boundaries for the 2026 midterm cycle. The boundaries that a federal panel had deemed discriminatory. The boundaries that weakened minority representation across numerous districts. The boundaries that essentially erased Jasmine Crockett's district as it presently existed. Greg Abbott's response was swift and celebratory. Texas is officially and lawfully redder. This represents a triumph for Texas residents, for rational thinking, and for the United States Constitution. Within mere moments, right-wing media burst into jubilation. Social media platforms exploded with Republicans proclaiming something like mission accomplished, with responses flooding in about how Democrats had been outsmarted, how Texas was secured for Republicans for the next 10 years, how progressive representation had been lawfully suppressed. Some of the discussion became personal, singling out Crockett directly with variations of "she's finished, eliminated by the boundaries. Texas has no use for her regardless. Farewell." It was political gloating at its most unfiltered, the type of collective attack that occurs when one faction believes they've landed a decisive victory. But then Jasmine Crockett issued her statement, and what she articulated wasn't a surrender or a reactive defense. It was something that made political analysts on both sides immediately begin reassessing their calculations about her first statement. Appeared deliberately, not with rage, but with the accuracy of someone who'd foreseen this outcome and readied for it. While today's ruling from the Supreme Court is disheartening, it's not surprising coming from a MAGA-controlled court. Here's what matters. Texans are now being instructed to cast ballots under boundaries that a panel of 3 federal judges right here in Texas determined were designed to diminish the representation of Black, Latino, and minority populations. Those conclusions remain valid. The Supreme Court merely hit pause, permitting these boundaries to be implemented for the 2026 election period while the litigation proceeds. That positioning was essential. She wasn't acknowledging the Supreme Court ruling as a conclusive judgment on the boundaries' constitutionality. She was reframing it as a temporary administrative postponement, reminding everyone that federal judges had already determined these boundaries discriminatory. The victory celebration Republicans were conducting wasn't about prevailing on substance. It was about receiving authorization to utilize boundaries that courts had identified as problematic while challenges persisted. She went on, and her approach moved from constitutional interpretation to direct confrontation. Let's be transparent. The Supreme Court did not declare these boundaries are just. They did not declare these boundaries are lawful. They did not reverse what the lower court determined. All they accomplished was permit boundaries that the lower court identified as discriminatory to remain active for the time being. With each statement, she was methodically deconstructing the Republican victory narrative. They hadn't prevailed on the argument. They'd secured a temporary reprieve for boundaries that were still facing legal scrutiny. It was the distinction between we demonstrated our boundaries are constitutional, and we persuaded the court to allow us to implement our boundaries while others are still demonstrating they're unconstitutional. That difference was significant, and Crockett was ensuring everyone grasped it. Then arrived the caution that would become the most extensively discussed element of her statement. The element that transformed her reaction from protective to aggressive. To every official celebrating this ruling, let me provide a note of warning. Don't become too confident. These boundaries were designed like political Russian roulette, fragmenting districts, narrowing advantages, and presuming voters wouldn't resist. When you manipulate district boundaries this aggressively, you threaten losing the exact districts you believed you secured. Political Russian roulette. The comparison was intentional and crushing. She wasn't merely stating that the boundaries were unjust. She was indicating they were tactically dangerous, that Republicans had been so forceful in attempting to maximize their benefit that they'd generated weakness in districts they assumed were protected. It was a forecast and a challenge combined into one expression. She supported the caution with current proof. We've already witnessed this occur. Consider Tennessee. They observed how narrow that contest became. If a supposedly protected district can decrease to single digits, nothing is assured. The Tennessee mention was specific and compelling. Republicans had redrawn boundaries there as well, certain they'd secured their dominance. But in the special contest that ensued, a supposedly protected Republican district had almost reversed, the advantage decreasing to fewer than 5 points in a district that had been double-digit Republican for years. It was validation for Crockett's position. Forceful gerrymandering could reverse when it motivated the exact voters it was intended to weaken. Her subsequent statement maintained the approach, incorporating another dimension to her caution. Even Texas Republicans are withdrawing from 2026. They recognize the indicators and understand these boundaries could become a catastrophe for their own faction. This was fresh intelligence that hadn't been extensively covered yet. Republican office holders in Texas discreetly choosing not to seek re-election. It could be chance. Departures occur every period. But the circumstances indicated something different. Seasoned officials examining redrawn boundaries and concluding they didn't want to gamble on a defeat in what was intended to be a protected district. If Republicans themselves weren't assured in these boundaries, why should anyone else trust Abbott's proclamations of triumph? Crockett's summary brought everything cohesively with a declaration that was part resistance, part political approach, and part direct confrontation to the authority structure that believed it had neutralized her. So, if Republicans believe these boundaries guarantee them authority, they're in for a shock. The ultimate decision does not rest with Donald Trump, Greg Abbott, or a Supreme Court prepared to disregard this. The ultimate decision rests with the citizens of Texas. When Texans have their voice, the outcomes will demonstrate for themselves. The reaction to her statements was swift and separated exactly along the divisions you'd anticipate. Conservatives rejected her as a bitter loser in refusal about political circumstances. But something different was occurring too, something that the contemptuous reactions overlooked. Her statements were being distributed tens of thousands of times by constituents, especially Black and Latino constituents who felt acknowledged, who felt their anger confirmed, who felt motivated rather than discouraged by her refusal to acknowledge this as a concluding result. Responses arrived from advocates. "We stand with you, Jasmine. Continue resisting. The authority is with the citizens." Boundaries designed in private chambers only appear invulnerable until constituents understand what was executed to them. The emotional connection was evident. This wasn't merely political analysis. It was a mobilizing message that was connecting with exactly the populations the redistricting had focused on. Behind closed doors, according to some individuals aware of discussions occurring in Democratic political networks, Crockett's statement had initiated something unanticipated. Conversations about whether being eliminated by the boundaries might actually generate possibilities rather than concluding them if her House district was effectively removed. What prevented her from campaigning statewide? What prevented her from utilizing the national visibility she'd established to contest for a Senate position or statewide position where gerrymandering couldn't limit her attraction? The conjecture gained legitimacy when political analysts started examining the information Crockett had implicitly mentioned in her statements. The revised Texas boundaries did establish what Republicans projected as 5 protected GOP districts. But to generate those protected districts, they'd had to distribute Republican constituents more thinly across numerous districts, decreasing advantages in districts that had previously been solidly red. They'd conducted a zero-sum calculation, generate new protected districts by rendering current districts less protected. A political science instructor at the University of Texas evaluating the boundaries after Crockett's statements informed journalists what Representative Crockett recognized is the fundamental danger in forceful partisan gerrymandering. You can design yourself additional districts theoretically, but if you've decreased your advantages across the spectrum, you're susceptible to surge elections or significant participation from the opposition faction. The 2018 midterms demonstrated this in numerous states. Gerrymandered boundaries that appeared invulnerable suddenly fractured when constituent energy surpassed the projections the boundaries were constructed on. More troubling for Republicans, Crockett's caution about Tennessee wasn't a singular instance. In Wisconsin, forceful Republican gerrymandering had generated numerous districts that reversed when Democratic participation increased. In North Carolina, supposedly protected districts had become contested when courts mandated slightly less partisan boundaries. The sequence was evident. Maximum gerrymandering generated maximum susceptibility when circumstances shifted, and Crockett was expressly committing to shift the circumstances. Her statements weren't merely analysis. They were a proclamation that she and the constituents she represented would not acknowledge these boundaries as valid, would not regard them as unchanging, and would struggle to demonstrate they were as susceptible as she asserted. When a political personality with her national visibility and her demonstrated capacity to motivate constituents makes that commitment, it becomes a self-fulfilling outcome. She would arrange, generate resources, and advocate specifically to demonstrate these boundaries could be defeated. And Republicans would have to protect against that organization in districts they believed they'd made protected. Greg Abbott's triumphant statement, "Texas is officially and lawfully redder," began to appear less like a triumph march and more like hasty celebration. Several Republican political advisors, speaking confidentially because they didn't want to openly challenge the governor, conveyed worry to journalists that Abbott's language was generating satisfaction among Republican constituents while concurrently motivating Democratic resistance. When you proclaim triumph this absolutely, you threaten your own constituents believing they don't need to participate, while providing the opposing faction a mobilizing message. One advisor clarified, Crockett just provided Democrats a framework. These boundaries are invalid, temporary, and defeatable. That's a significantly more motivating communication than "we got disadvantaged and there's nothing we can accomplish about it." The difference between Abbott's confidence and Crockett's tactical resistance highlighted different methods to political obstacles. Abbott was regarding the Supreme Court's administrative ruling as a conclusive triumph, proclaiming the issue resolved. Crockett was regarding it as a temporary barrier to be surmounted, expressly committing that constituents would have the ultimate voice, regardless of what courts or boundary designers planned. One method presumed the boundaries controlled results. The other method committed to demonstrate that constituents could defeat even manipulated boundaries. In the days subsequent to the statements, indicators appeared that Crockett's communication was connecting, beyond just her current advocates. Voter enrollment associations in Texas documented increases in enrollment inquiries, especially among younger constituents and constituents of color. Democratic contributors began allocating resources toward Texas contests that had previously been regarded as uncompetitive. And perhaps most revealing, several Republican officeholders in redrawn districts initiated running advertisements highlighting their autonomy and community emphasis. The type of framing you conduct when you're concerned about a contested contest, not when you're assured in a protected district. A Democratic political professional knowledgeable with Texas politics provided this evaluation. What Jasmine accomplished was restructure a defeat into a purpose. Instead of acknowledging that she got redistricted away from authority, she converted it into evidence that Republicans are frightened of her and constituents like her. And she committed those constituents that they could demonstrate the boundaries incorrect. That's compelling communication. It converts what could have been discouragement into organization. The question that remained unanswered, intentionally so from Crockett's viewpoint, was what she intended to pursue next. Her district, as presently structured, might not exist in 2026, but that didn't signify her political trajectory was concluded. It might signify it was about to grow beyond the limitations of a single district. Statewide contests don't have the same susceptibility to gerrymandering. You can't redesign state boundaries to weaken representation. If Crockett campaigned for Senate or another statewide position, she'd be contesting in an environment where the boundary manipulations Republicans had conducted couldn't shield them. That likelihood that being eliminated by the boundaries might propel her to campaign for elevated position, where she'd be even more threatening to Republican authority of Texas, was the implication beneath her statements that political professionals instantly identified. She wasn't merely cautioning Republicans about 2026 House contests. She was suggesting that their effort to remove her from the House might result in her campaigning for something greater. In her concluding communication embedded in the statements, Crockett had expressed the fundamental concept that made her statement more than just political framing. The ultimate decision rests with the citizens of Texas. It was a Democratic conviction that exceeded the pessimism of gerrymandering and the frustration of Supreme Court rulings. Boundaries could be designed, courts could determine, officials could celebrate, but ultimately constituents would resolve. And if sufficient constituents rejected the validity of boundaries intended to suppress them, those boundaries would collapse, regardless of their constitutional standing. For Greg Abbott, celebrating his triumph while Jasmine Crockett was committing to demonstrate him incorrect, the approaching months would disclose whether he'd prevailed in a skirmish or established a significantly larger defeat. Because, as Crockett had cautioned, when you design boundaries like Russian roulette, eventually the chamber that's occupied appears. And the initial indicators indicated that the political projectile might be traveling directly for the districts Republicans believed they'd made protected. If this examination of how Jasmine Crockett converted a redistricting defeat into a mobilization possibility demonstrated you why hasty triumph celebrations can reverse dramatically, hit that like button and subscribe for more evaluation of the instances when political obstacles become opportunities. Share a comment informing us whether you believe forceful gerrymandering benefits or damages the faction that designs the boundaries. And distribute this with anyone who needs to comprehend that boundaries don't cast ballots. Citizens do. Your participation helps us keep addressing the narratives about democracy resisting against those who attempt to manipulate.